done like a live reading.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to English Theater Berlin International Performing Arts Center. We are very thrilled to be able to offer our first live event in the U.S. Embassy Literature Series for quite some time, for obvious reasons. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Isaac Martin from the U.S. Embassy in Berlin to tell you a little bit more about this evening and our collaboration.
Thank you, Daniel. So my name is Isaac Martin. I'm the Assistant Cultural Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy, and what a thrill it is to be here, back in person, doing the U.S. Embassy Literature Series. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out today, and I'd also like to note that we are doing a live stream as well, because the demand to come here was so great, but unfortunately we couldn't do everyone in person. So this hybrid format might be a reality that we have to deal with going forward, but it's still great that whether we're here in the theater or watching online, we're able to share this experience. We'd love to thank our partners at the English Theater of Berlin, Daniel, Renee, and Luther Grosser for their continued partnership with this series. It's great to finally be back doing it after a little bit of a hiatus. I'd like to thank my colleague at the U.S. Embassy, Martina Cole, who has been instrumental in keeping this program going. And of course, our friends at the American Academy Berlin, we have Johanna Gallup here, but they are great in always sharing their wonderful fellows with us, so we can do this joint programming together like this evening's great event. And speaking for our fellows, thank you, Lady Hubbard, for coming out tonight and sharing your brilliant writing with all of us. And last but not least, I'd like to give a special thank you to our moderator, Potjans, who just handed in her dissertation today, and then decided to come out tonight and moderate this event. So what a super woman. That's fantastic. So anyways, without further ado, enough of me talking, please sit back and enjoy tonight's program. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. And it's so amazing to see so many people again after all this time. I'm extremely excited to be here, and I would also like to thank the American Embassy for hosting and planning this event, and of course everybody involved in the proceedings of this reading tonight, and also especially Martina Cole for organizing and coordinating. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Ladee Hubbard, who is joining us here in Berlin from New Orleans. Ladee is currently a fellow at the Mary Ellen von der Heyden Fellow. Is currently a Mary Ellen von der Heyden Fellow in fiction at the American Academy in Berlin, where she, as I believe, works on her latest book project, The Descendants, which places the 1980s war on drugs in dialogue with the history of African Americans subjected to drug trials and medical experiments. We are excited and honored, Ladee, that you are able to be here with us tonight and to read from your wonderful book, The Ripken, which was published this year. Ladee Hubbard, who holds a PhD in World Arts and Cultures and an MFA in Creative Writing, is also the author of the prized novel, The Talented Ripkens, which was her debut novel and was published in 2017. For this book, Ladee has received a Hearst and Wright Foundation Legacy Award for debut fiction. In addition to that, she is a prolific short story writer, and a collection of her short stories entitled The Blinking What is forthcoming in 2022, and which I'm extremely looking forward to, by the way. Her nonfiction writing appeared in such famous formats as the Times Literary Supplement. In her work, she focuses on many different themes regarding Black life in the US, but if I interpret it correctly, the relationship between Black culture and food, and also the different ways in which African Americans have grappled with the notion of progress seem to be recurring themes in her work. Ladee has read from her work in various places of the world, such as France, Brazil, and various places across the United States. It is a tremendous pleasure, Ladee, to have you here with us tonight. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Ladee Hubbard.
Thank you.
And I think we will start off the evening with your reading.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And or you want to read first? Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So in case people don't know, it's the Rib King. It's set in the early 20th century. Half of the book is in 1914, the other half is in 1924. And it's about a man, an African-American man who's a servant for a wealthy white family, or they were wealthy, they've kind of fallen on hard times. And he invents a meat sauce and sells it, the recipe for it, for a very small amount of money. And it is subsequently manufactured, and the people that manufacture it use a caricature of his face as the sort of the icon for the label. And then it becomes a national sensation, and it's very popular all over the country. And he doesn't receive any of the profits, and so he spends the rest of his life touring the country giving cooking demonstrations as the Rib King. So that's basically, at least that's the surface plot. There's other things going on, but I'm just going to read from the first chapter, and the first chapter is called The Current Orphans. Mr. Sitwell had finished work and was passing through the garden on his way to Prescott Avenue when he happened to look up at the house and see something he shouldn't have. One of the Barclays' Current Orphans was standing in the main hall. Dressed in a gray shirt and dark blue knee pants, black stockings sagging above his brown shoes, the boy had his hands on his hips and his head cocked to one side as he stared, transfixed by the antique starter pistol on the third shelf of Mrs. Barclay's cabinet d'objets. Mr. Sitwell frowned. The child had arrived from the asylum with two others 5 months before, and Miss Mamie, the cook who was in charge of their apprenticeship, told them the very first day that scullery boys were forbidden from loitering in the front of the house. Yet there the child was, just inside the window for all the world to see. Mr. Sitwell watched him reach into the cabinet and pull the pistol out. He peeked inside the chamber, then spun around and pointed it 3 times, left toward the velvet drapes, right toward the side table, and straight up above him toward the chandelier. Then he smiled and mimicked the gesture of sliding the gun into an imaginary holster. When his game was finished, he put the pistol back and then turned and continued walking down the hall. But instead of heading toward the kitchen where he belonged, he was moving farther away from it, toward the conservatory. Mr. Sitwell cocked his head and looked around the hall, trying to find the other two. The Barclays always brought orphans home in batches of 3, and following the example of the industrial college, always between the ages of 14 and 15, making them old enough to work, but not so old that, in Mr. Barclay's view, the clay had so far hardened that it could not be reformed. For the past 20 years, they had been brought in at regular intervals to learn a trade under the supervision of the cook. Mostly they washed dishes, but by doing so, fulfilled Mrs. Barclay's sense of charitable obligation. The Current Orphans were extremely close, and Mr. Sitwell knew that if he saw one, the other 2 were sure to be nearby. They did everything together, and in fact so favored one another that the first time he saw them, standing in a row on the kitchen porch with their hands clasped behind their backs for Miss Mamie's inspection, he'd had a hard time telling them apart. He'd soon realized that the easiest way to distinguish between them was to look for their scars. Frederick was the one with the 3 nasty welts running in parallel lines down his left cheek, a memento of a frantic fork slashing from a South Side butcher with whom he'd had an unfortunate run-in when he was 7. Mac was the one who'd lost part of his right ear to a stockyard dog when he was 8. The one loitering in the hall now was Bart. Mr. Sitwell knew it as soon as he started walking. Bart had a peculiar way of moving, a staggered hop step caused by the fact that, due to circumstances he claimed he no longer remembered, he was missing the toes of his right foot. Bart hopped down the hall for a few moments and then stopped when he reached the door to the conservatory. Something, it seemed, was amiss with his trousers, and he reached down to make some adjustment to his buttons. When he was satisfied, he swung his arm behind him, grabbed a fistful of fabric from his rear, and lifted his right foot out to shake out his pants leg. He set the foot down again, and after a couple more hops, disappeared through the conservatory door. Bart seemed awfully foolish. Mr. Sitwell's first thought was relief that he was not responsible for him, that all 3 boys were, technically, Miss Mamie's problem. But of course, Mr. Sitwell was the one who'd seen Bart, and having seen him, realized he had to make a choice. Either he would continue walking toward his streetcar stop as planned, or he would go back inside and drag Bart to the safety of the kitchen before any of the Barclays saw him too, in which case he would no doubt be sent packing. Then the door to Mr. Barclay's study opened, unleashing a wide swath of light just inside the window where Mr. Sitwell stood. He ducked down as a woman's voice called out, "Fine, Herbert, but remember this is not the Monte Carlo. We have not been to the Monte Carlo in a very long time." Mrs. Barclay appeared in the window, skirt swishing and heels clicking as she moved down the hall towards the stairs in the upper chambers. Without thinking, Mr. Sitwell found himself jogging along the side of the house, headed for the kitchen. It wasn't until he reached the back porch that it occurred to him why he was doing it, that he liked these boys, cared about them, wanted them to do well. In the 20 years he'd worked for the Barclays, he'd seen dozens of orphans come and go, and always thought it a shame that Miss Mamie's predecessor, Mr. Boudreau, never did much to help them. He wasn't certain if it was something about these particular children or simply the fact that Miss Mamie handled her orphans so differently than Mr. Boudreau had handled his that had made such an impression on him. He noticed how careful they were not to tramp on his flowers when they walked through the garden, and he liked that they asked a lot of questions about herbs. He also liked that when they did ask questions, instead of scolding them for slacking the way Mr. Boudreau would have done, Mamie seemed pleased they took an interest in something she considered useful. She was determined to actually teach them something and wanted them to leave the house knowing more than they had when they arrived. It was clear that she cared for them, and because of that, Mr. Sitwell found he couldn't help but care for them too. He stepped inside the house. Also, of course, there was the fact that he had started out like them, waterfront orphan, beneficiary of the peculiar mingling of the Barclays' need for cheap labor and their relatively liberal views on children's reform. Mr. Sitwell was only 14 when he was plucked from the yard of the asylum. He'd started in the kitchen, and while other orphans came and went, had managed to stay on, gaining more and more of the Barclays' confidence through a combination of talent, wit, and fealty. He passed through the pantry, pushed into the dark kitchen, then stopped when he saw Ginny, the new chambermaid, standing by the window next to a large stack of napkins set out on the work table, all tucked into 3-corner folds. She had her back to him and was looking out at the yard, a cigarette in her hand. When she heard him come in, she turned around and smiled. "Evening." Mr. Sitwell nodded. He could feel the muscles in his face tighten and was glad the room was dark. He'd been practicing talking to Ginny in the mirror at the rooming house where he lived. He knew he had an unfortunate habit of frowning at pretty women, and also that he looked ugly when he did. "You're here late." "Had to finish these," she nodded to the stack. Mr. Sitwell struggled to fit his face into a smile as calm and cool as hers. "Miss Mamie making you stay to do all that?" "Honestly, she told me to do it this morning. I forgot," Ginny said, one arm wrapped in front of her waist, the other hand holding the cigarette. "Don't tell her." Mr. Sitwell arched his eyebrows in an effort to keep his brow from furrowing over. "How you getting home, Ginny?" "What on earth do you mean?" "I just mean it's late." "Is it?" She glanced at the clock on the counter near the stove. 9? "Well, I guess it depends who you ask." She was still smiling. Mr. Sitwell had noticed that about her. She smiled a lot, had a way of talking to people as if what she really wanted to do was laugh at them. When she first started working there 2 months before, it had hurt his feelings a couple of times before he realized she talked to everybody like that, even Miss Mamie, that it was just her way. "I could walk you to the streetcar, if you'd like. Make sure you get there safe." He looked away from her toward the sink and was disappointed when he saw the stack of dirty pots still piled there. "Well, aren't you sweet?" Ginny said. "That's real nice, Sitwell. Honestly, I can't imagine a girl needs much protection in this neighborhood, never mind the hour, but I certainly would appreciate the company." Mr. Sitwell nodded and looked back at the pots. If the Barclays didn't send those boys back to the asylum for wandering the halls at night, Miss Mamie just might, if they were stupid enough to leave a mess like that. Could you wait a few minutes? I've got to take care of something right quick. All right, Sitwell, I don't mind waiting. Give me a chance to put these napkins away. She flicked her cigarette out the window. Mr. Sitwell reached down to straighten his tie, then pushed through the swinging door that led to the front of the house. As he passed through the dining room, his heart was beating fast, but he had to figure that hadn't gone so bad. He'd been trying to think of questions to ask Jenny since she started working there, but that was the first time they'd been alone. Jenny, he decided, was a nice person, and looking back on their conversation, not scary at all. A lot of people on staff didn't know what to make of her, in part because of all the smiling, but also because they were still adjusting to the fact that Petunia, the woman she'd replaced, was indeed gone. Petunia's termination had been a shock, not because she'd been good at her job, but because she'd been there doing her job badly for so long. When Mamie got promoted and took charge of the kitchen, it seemed like the first thing she did was send Petunia home. He walked up a short flight of stairs and entered the main hall, the chandelier above him shining a harsh light on the objects in Mrs. Barclay's cabinet. He looked at the pistol that had so entranced Bart and noticed at once that the gilt was peeling on the handle. Several other items on the shelves were chipped or otherwise damaged. Electric lighting, which seemed necessary only because everyone else on the block now had it, had not been kind to that house. There was a reason for the care Mrs. Lawson, the parlor maid, took to ensure each lamp was covered with a cloth of a particular weight when company came to dinner. Some of the rugs in the halls were worn down and frayed from overuse. There were water stains on the side tables in the parlor, and the velvet cushions of the couch in the conservatory were sun-bleached in places. All of these flaws had been there for years, but were made disturbingly visible in the new glare. He continued down the hall. He still remembered when he was a boy like the three he was looking for now, how fine that house had seemed to him, the glitz and glitter of the various curios in Mrs. Barclay's cabinet sparking in the warm glow of the gaslights. There had been a time when he'd been convinced this was not simply the finest house he'd ever seen, but perhaps the finest there ever was. Then, one day when he was 15, he was standing in the front yard and happened to look beyond the Barclays' fence. For the first time, it occurred to him that most of the houses on the avenue were twice the size of the one where he worked, that the Barclays had neighbors who, if they wanted to, could have bought and sold both his employers and everything they owned several times over. He must have looked over that fence 1,000 times before this actually occurred to him. Before that, the house had always been just another part of the block, an extension of the world it belonged to, and therefore extremely precious. He moved past the stairs. Perhaps the Barclays weren't as rich and important as they once were, but it was still a good house. The boys had a good thing there, whether they realized it or not. What they'd been given wasn't exactly charity, but it was better than the industrial college, where scores of boys and girls shivered on a cold factory room floors 14 hours a day. Here, they worked hard, but they slept on warm cots at night, and Miss Mamie made sure they were always well fed. The Barclays were not crazy enough to be unmanageable and, miraculously for the times, still maintained an entirely colored staff. The Barclays had come to the city from Missouri 35 years before with their cook, Mr. Boudreau. They did not believe in race mixing in the kitchen, rightly thought it caused too many problems. Because Mr. Boudreau had been colored, the rest of the staff, out of necessity, had to be colored too. When he finally left, Miss Mamie, his former assistant, had been the obvious choice to take his place. This meant that so long as she continued to cook and maintain order to the Barclays' satisfaction, the opportunity to be reformed in the kitchen would remain the exclusive preserve of 3 colored orphans between the ages of 14 and 15. When he reached the conservatory, he heard a loud, "Ooh," followed by a series of childish giggles. He pushed the door open and found the 3 boys huddled together on the floor near the piano with Frederick in the center. From the halting sound of Frederick's voice, Mr. Sitwell could tell he was reading. Now that Cherokee knew that Wash Talbot, his former deputy, had been arrested, he had to make a choice. keep his vow to never again set foot in Seminole County or let the last remaining member of his gang fall into the hands of an angry mob. What are you boys doing? They spun around in unison and blinked at him with enormous brown eyes. They were handsome children with bright round faces, thick eyebrows, full lips, and skin the dark red color of cedar wood. Their features were so similar that anybody would have mistaken them for actual brothers. In truth, they were not blood relatives at all. Their strong bond formed in the interest of survival on the waterfront. Nothing, sir, Max smiled, eyes all innocent. Just sitting here reading. In the front of the house? Oh, nobody saw us. We made sure them folks was long gone before we came in here, Frederick said. He lifted his arms and rocked back and forth in imitation of someone else's waltz. We waited until they finished dancing. Mr. Sitwell frowned. Somebody saw you. I did. Saw Bart playing in the hall when I was on my way out. Then come to find out you haven't even finished cleaning the kitchen. Not true, sir. Kitchen's all done, Bart said. Well, except for the pots. But remember last time how Miss Mamie told us not to disturb Mr. Barclay's guests with a lot of banging while folks were eating dinner? Figured this time we'd just wait till the dinner was over so as not to bother nobody. The boy looked very proud of himself. It's all right, sir. We don't mind working late. The last guest left over an hour ago, Mr. Sitwell said. Really? Dang, it didn't feel like we'd been in here but 5 minutes. The boys stared at one another as if there was something wondrous about their shared trance. You mean to say we've been sitting here reading all that time? Mr. Sitwell held out his hand. Give it to me. Frederick gave him the book. On the cover was a picture of a tall, thin white man with green eyes and a long red beard, clutching a pistol in each hand. What is this? The Life and Times of Cherokee Red, wild man of the Reconstruction, Frederick said. You ever read it? No, but you heard about him, right? Started out during the war, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Now his gang's all busted up. He and his lady love moved out west to put the past behind him, and he's been trying his hand at being a farmer. But just when it seems like his gunslinging days are over, he finds out Wash Talbot, last surviving member of his gang, got caught stealing hogs and got himself locked up back in Florida. What? He stole a hog. Who did? Wash Talbot. Mr. Sitwell squinted at the cover. He'd never heard of Cherokee Red, but he knew the name Wash Talbot from when he was a boy back in Florida, just like in the book. He handed it to Frederick. Where does it say that name? Show me. Wash Talbot. Frederick opened the book and started flipping pages. After a while, he set his finger down and read, Another infamous member of the gang was Wash Talbot, who never would renounce his lawless ways. For years after the gang disbanded, he was still hiding out in the swamps of Seminole County, a terror to the neighboring towns. That's enough, Mr. Sitwell said. Pernicious lies. Sir, I knew that man. Who? Cherokee Red? Wash Talbot. He was a simple farmer. The boys looked disappointed. Probably not the same man then, Max said. Was your Wash from Seminole too? Mr. Sitwell shook his head. I don't recall. He was lying, compelled by a childhood admonishment to say nothing about where he came from, even though he realized there was no cause for it any longer. It was the same reason he'd refused to give his real name when, lured by the promise of food, he'd voluntarily entered the doors of the asylum 20 years before. And then again, a few months after that, when he found himself standing on the Barclays' back porch, hands clasped behind his back and wedged between two other boys. Where did you get this? One of Mr. Barclay's guests gave it to us after Tuesday's party. Mr. Sitwell frowned. It's the truth, sir, Frederick said. We didn't steal it, Mr. Sitwell. I'm going to have to ask Mr. Barclay about that. That's fine, but can we finish it first? We were just getting to the best part. What part is that? It's the beginning of the end. Mr. Sitwell sighed. Despite the lives they'd led and the work they did, they were still such children. Yet he knew if they did not learn certain lessons, they would not last long in the Barclay house, to say nothing of the world outside it. You boys are going to have to be more careful. You've got to remember who you are. You've got to remember where. You shouldn't be in the front of the house. You shouldn't be talking to Mr. Barclay's guests, much less, as you say, accepting gifts from them. I didn't lie, Frederick pouted. I tell you, he said we could have it. That's not the point. What if you misunderstood the man's meaning? Or what if the man simply changed his mind? Don't you realize that an accusation of theft can be just as bad as a theft itself? Sometimes it's even worse. No, sir, I suppose we didn't think about those things, Frederick nodded. I understand. Mr. Sitwell frowned. He could tell from the boy's expression that Frederick thought he understood, but also that, in truth, he did not. Best get back there and finish that kitchen before Miss Mamie sees it. Yes, sir. They scrambled to their feet and sprinted down the hall. Mr. Studwell stood for a moment with the book in his hands, trying to decide what to do with it. He looked at the cover. Mr. Sitwell was only 9 when he left Florida, and there were many things about those early days he no longer recalled. The name Wash Talbot, however, was not one of them. The man had been a neighbor friend of his mother's, and, as he told the boys, came from a family of subsistence farmers, much like his own family had been. It certainly seemed more than mere coincidence that, as was true of the outlaw in the book, the Wash he remembered had come to his end over conflicting claims with a man from the neighboring town over livestock. Except, and this too Mr. Sitwell remembered with perfect clarity, the Wash he'd known hadn't been jailed over a hog. It was a mule, and he hadn't stolen it. He'd shot it. So, stop there. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Ladee, for this wonderful reading from the beginning of your book. And I guess that brings us already to the first question that I wanted to ask you, which is regarding the 3 boys, Frederick, Mac, and Bart, that are a very prominent part of this first chapter. And you said at one point that Mr. Sitwell tells them apart by looking at the scars that they have, and they seem in some way very much deformed.
Mm-hmm.
And can you say something about the meaning of those scars and what you thought when you constructed these 3 characters?
Yes. There's a lot about minstrelsy and the enduring impact of stereotypes of African Americans that kind of runs through the book. And so on one sense, in terms of that, the scars are just to signify that they all have, they're not just like the orphans in the house. They're not just stock characters, mm-hmm. that they have pasts and traumas that they have endured before they came to the house, and that these things impact how they behave within it, mm-hmm. or why it's important to them mm-hmm. to be in the house, mm-hmm. right? Also, just in terms of the what is going on in the book, this it really just starts off with, it's a through line for all the other things that go on with Mr. Sitwell in terms of him becoming the Rib King. He's trying to be a caregiver to these 3 mm-hmm. children, and clearly he's not even exactly sure why he's mm-hmm. doing that, but he is. He's trying to preserve their lives, and that was really sort of the emotional, I don't know what you call it, the heart of the book for me, mm-hmm. because a lot of it was actually written, even though it's a historical novel, but this does all pertain. I started writing it very shortly after the man who killed Trayvon Martin in the United States was acquitted. And I don't know how familiar people are here with that, but it was a teenager, mm-hmm. right, in a hoodie. Mm-hmm. And I guess he looked suspicious. Mm-hmm. And this led to him being killed for looking mm-hmm. suspicious. So I was really thinking about, and of course that's what inspired the hashtag. I think a lot of people felt very strongly about that as well, because that's where the Black Lives Matter hashtag originated. Mm-hmm. But I was really struck by the fact that for all the progress that has been made in society, that you would just have this fundamental sense of your children being endangered because there's something suspicious about them. And that's very deeply ingrained in stereotypes and minstrel images and their enduring impact today on the lives and life chances of specifically African American children. So even though it's a historical novel, part of the reason I wrote it was because I was really concerned about the enduring impact of these things. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it's specifically about a man who's trying, and literally in the course of the book, he tries every strategy he can think of to protect these children and keep them alive, and all of them prove not fully sufficient. So in that it is a response to things that were happening now. But yeah, they are, that's how you can, they're not just stock characters, right? Because there's a lot of playing with that in the first part in terms of the household staff. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that extensive answer. I think that kind of also already leads me to the second question that I have, and you already mentioned the word. You said that minstrelsy is an important theme in the novel, and maybe I don't know how familiar people are with the term, but maybe we can say a little bit about what it is, where it comes from, and
yeah, it's very important to the history of American theater, and sort of it's one way to trace the lineage of like vaudeville and things like that. Minstrelsy was the most popular form of entertainment in the United States for a very long time, which is performing in blackface. And there's actually a minstrel show has a very specific structure, and it's like they do comedy skits. But and in terms of this book, so the characters in the first part are all they are for me deconstructions of minstrel stereotypes, and a very significant part of that history of the popularity of minstrelsy is intersected by something that was called Tom shows, which were theatrical productions of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So most people in the United States, I believe, knew that story as it was performed in blackface, right? People performed it in blackface as opposed to reading the book. And so it had different meanings for people when they see it that way. So all of the characters in the house correspond to minstrel stereotypes on a certain level, right? So the kids they're kind of like Topsies. They're kind of cute, which is why, but they're not, you know, they're like, oh, the orphan children that work in the kitchen, and they're so happy and loving and cute, you know, and they're just there. And so that's part of the scars. They're not just there. They have histories, and Mr. Sitwell is the epitome of the loyal servant. And then the woman that cooks in is their cook is Mamie, and she is sort of, in my mind, like a deconstruction of the mammy figure. Ginny, I was thinking about Jezebel, which is another stereotype, and then Mr. Whit. There are all these like, I don't know, there's like the good version and the bad version. So there's like the mammy and the Jezebel, and then there's like Uncle Tom, and then I don't know what the name is for it, but there's also someone that works in the house that's actually the chauffeur, and he always has a knife in his hand. So it's like, but they're not stereotypes. But what I mean by that is when I wrote it, I was very conscious of the fact that if the Barclays were telling this story, all of these characters would seem completely different to them. And in part, it's because of their own sort of preconceived notions of what black people are, and in part, it's because in order to continue working in the house, they are performing roles. So it's very interesting because a lot a lot of images and stereotypes that emerge from the theater and from books and things that there's no motive for the behavior, right? That's just how they act. So I was really conscious of those kinds of dynamics when I was creating the characters.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
No, this is extremely illuminating. Yeah, and you already also talked about Mamie and Jenny, and you kind of also already said that
I
they
can
kind
talk
of
more about Mamie and Jenny.
Oh, please do. Yeah.
Well, just very briefly, because it pertains there's another book in the book, right? This Cherokee Life and Times of Cherokee Red, that is actually going to prove very pivotal to Mr. Sitwell, because he sees his own story retold in this book, and it's all wrong. These are all things he doesn't talk about. He doesn't talk about where he came from before he sort of just appeared as an orphan at the Barclays, at their back door or whatever. So, but he's actually the sole survivor of a town in the South that was destroyed during the racial violence that followed the Reconstruction. So there was a lot of violence against African Americans during this period of time, which fueled a lot of the Great Migration, which is why black people started fleeing, because they were fleeing terrorism often to the north, right? So he's part of that story, but he doesn't talk about it. One is because he's traumatized by it. So he has this whole persona, but it's a very shaky edifice for him. And so they have this book, and he realizes that it is talking about people he knew, and it's retelling sort of his history, but it's completely different, and it's made to mean something else. So that relates to Mamie and Jezebel, because I'm sort of fascinated by, I said Mamie instead of Mammy, I'm sorry. It's Mammy and Jezebel, and in the book it's Jenny and Mamie. These are like two very dominating images of African American women, and one is the Mammy, who works in the house, she's a servant, and she's very loyal to her employers or her owners during slavery. She takes care of the children, she does the cooking, and she's a very asexual figure, right? Very sort of non-threatening, but she's, very protective of these kids. If I were to get into the details of sort of what that character stands for. There's also a part where she tends to be much more in the kitchen with her own family, not nearly as loving, right? Very domineering and emasculating to her husband, right? Sort of a shrew. There'd be all these images of chasing him around with a broom or something like that. But very loving and loyal and very asexual. And then another dominant image of African American women was as very sexually promiscuous, right? And not associated with the household, but just sort of out doing their thing. They're very, they're like temptresses, and that's kind of like the Jezebel. And I was really interested in how those two representations, what they do in terms of sort of constituting, they don't make sense except in relationship to the vulnerability of African American women to, honestly, sexual violence, right? So in that sense, they're sort of mirrors of each other, because the Jezebel, to me, is like an explanation for why there were all of these interracial liaisons, right? That are being there. It's a way to portray them as not rape, or at the very least coercive, right? This has happened a lot. Obviously, African American women in slavery and after were very vulnerable to sexual violence, right? You didn't really have a legal what are you going to do? You didn't really have a legal recourse to you know what I mean? And so the Jezebel is like, well, she's a very she's inherently promiscuous. She's a promiscuous woman, and so this is one embodiment that you see a lot of African Americans. And then the mammy is like very asexual. She's the one that's domesticated. So it's almost like if you look at what happens when you're outside of the household, when you're inside the household. Also, it's a way to make the position of the fact that you would have black women as routinely, they're doing all the cooking, they're taking care of all the kids, but there's nothing threatening about her presence because she's completely asexual, right? And neither of these obviously are reflections of reality. Do you know what I mean? So,
Absolutely.
yes, I was very interested in the implications of that. The reason I mentioned that in terms of the story is because I think that they're doing something. They're telling a story, right? These stereotypes are doing a lot of work, right? And they're speaking to reality, and it's sort of a way to excuse it or to talk about it in a way that's not problematic. And that's why the book is also in there. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Was that a long explanation?
Please, we want to hear from you.
Yeah. So that's what that is. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was also just thinking while you were talking that these stereotypes, of course, also somehow give us a little bit more that is behind that. And that, like you said, like they tell a story and there's somehow something more to know about the story that is being told, right? It's kind of really flat, but actually there's a lot of knowledge that is kind of buried underneath.
Buried in it, yes.
Yeah.
And that's yes, because what drives Mr. Sitwell crazy is not the erasure, it's sort of like the way this book that the kids are reading becomes like a monument to that erasure, right? It's covering over all of these things. But it's making him ask questions or thinking about things that he has repressed for a very long time. Yeah.
Yeah, so the next question actually is about Mr. Sitwell also. And he also already said that he's the sort of the epitome of the loyal servant, and obviously servitude plays a huge role in your book. And but of course somehow, and we already also touched upon that, this sort of these structures of servitude that they're in are very much reminiscent of the structures of enslavement in certain forms.
Yeah.
I mean, they're being compensated, of course, in some way for the work that they do, but then the roles seem to be still sort of retained. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. If that was even a question.
No. Yeah, because there's a lot about labor too, and commodities, and sort of the transition that becomes expressed as products in here.
Yeah.
The transition from African Americans being regarded as commodities to being used to advertise commodities, right? Because that's really this era that I'm talking about in the beginning of the 20th century. It's really the beginning of commodity culture in the United States as well.
Yeah.
And it's also the period where people are, they've just been emancipated and they're trying to. Yeah, so there's a lot of linkage between.
Absolutely.
It's definitely not a clean demarcation of before and after.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting to think about that. Also because, there was this idea of reconstruction and then things were supposed to change, but they also kind of didn't. Do you actually hear me? I'm so far away from my mic. Yeah? Just not? Okay, perfect.
Can you hear me? I didn't realize something to be like
We've been so wrapped up in the conversation.
Yeah, just let me know if you can't hear me.
Okay, maybe, next question would be about the story Cherokee read. And there is kind of this idea that the story within the story also has a particular function for sort of the continuation of the plot. And I was wondering if you could say a bit about that. I mean, obviously it kind of links to Mr. Sitwell's childhood and to his personal story, but does it also kind of link to the narrative that you created?
Yeah, well, it's a scar. It's another version of a scar, right? Because that's his part. A lot of the it's actually the story that his memories of what happened are based on, they're based on fact, on things that actually happened. There's a book by a man named Horace Mann Bond called The Star Creek Papers, and it's about all of this really ugly violence that started out over a mule, because in his recollection, it's someone said they'd buy the mule from him, and then they didn't they didn't pay him for it. But he had no recourse, and no one would help him, so he shot the mule. And that triggered all of this violence, like this black man going into the white town and shooting the mule. So it's a reference to things that happened after the Reconstruction. There was a lot of terrorism going on in the South during that period.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's his scar.
Yeah.
And he's repressed all of this so that he can just get through the day, and it just starts coming back up. So, yeah.
Okay, I was thinking maybe you want to read a little more.
Sure.
If you're already, I think it's time to do that.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, we talked about this one passage, which then would also link up to my next question.
Okay. All right. So the beginning of the this. Yes.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So this is the beginning of chapter 6. So I think it will make sense. This is right before he's about to sell the sauce. He's invented the sauce. Someone wants to buy it, wants the recipe for it. But he made the sauce with Mamie. Mamie helped him make the sauce. It's called White Man in the Kitchen. He and Bart wound up escorting Mr. Boudreaux all the way home. Then Mr. Sitwell felt obliged to ride the train back with Bart in order to ensure the pistol was properly returned to the cabinet. He did not get back to his rooming house until 11:30 that evening. When he returned to the house the following morning, he found Bart sitting calmly on the back porch, staring up at the sky and whistling to himself. It was a strange, trilling bird call that stopped as soon as he noticed Mr. Sitwell watching him. "Morning," Bart smiled. Mr. Sitwell nodded. "I want you to stay in the yard for the next few days, hear me? No running errands for Mamie today. No going beyond the gate." "Yes, sir. I mean it now. That was very foolish what you did last night, bringing that pistol. You understand that, don't you?" "If you say so." "If I say so." Mr. Sitwell shook his head. "You act as if you don't realize what you did. And you act if you don't remember why I did it. I wasn't trying to start nothing with those people. It's not my fault I can't run. It's just a fact. I imagine it's why they cut my toes off in the first place, because they didn't want me running. I thought you said you didn't remember what happened to your foot." "I remember. I just don't like talking about it. The toes are gone, and talking about them is not going to bring them back." He frowned. "It's not the only mark on me, you know, just the one you've seen. I got plenty marks. You want me to show them to you too? All the other places I've been cut up? Tell you about them too?" "No, of course not," Mr. Sitwell said. "Just promise me you will stay in the house until I tell you it's safe to go out." "Whatever you say, sir," Bart said. "Also, there's a white man in the kitchen." "Excuse me? A white man?" "That's why Mamie got me out here waiting on you. Told me to tell you as soon as you showed up for work this morning." He walked into the kitchen and saw it was true. A large white man in a gray suit was seated at the kitchen table while Mamie stood by the stove. He glanced up as Mr. Sitwell walked past him, but instead of acknowledging Mr. Sitwell's presence, looked back at the floor and muttered to himself, words that, although Mr. Sitwell could not actually hear them, were quite clearly angry curses. Mr. Sitwell went and stood next to Mamie. "Who is that?" "Another cook," Mamie said between clenched teeth. "Mr. Pound brought him here. Apparently the plan is for me to reproduce the sauce we prepared yesterday. This man will watch me work and transcribe the recipe for Mr. Pound." "The recipe?" "It seems Mr. Pound is under the impression that I am unable to read and therefore incapable of transcribing a recipe myself. Can you imagine? How does he think I could possibly function as a cook in a house such as this without the ability to read a recipe book? I don't understand. Why?" Well, Sitwell, from what I gather, not from anything said to me, mind you, but from what I have learned secondhand from Ginny, Mr. Pound has decided he's going to manufacture our sauce, to sell it, without a word to either you or me about it. Can you imagine? Mr. Sitwell frowned. No, I cannot. Ginny says he and Mr. Barclay are in the parlor right now discussing it. Apparently, he claims his dealings with Barclay hinge upon it. Again, all without a word to you or me. Mr. Sitwell glanced at the white cook. Did you give it to him? Of course not, and neither shall you. Why not? Give them what they want and send them on their way. Because I am not a fool, Mamie said, a little too loudly. The cook looked up and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I may play a fool on occasion in the front of the house, so perhaps Mr. Pound has an excuse for thinking me so. But Mr. Barclay knows better, and so do you. If Mr. Pound wants that recipe, he should talk to one of us, not Barclay, and he should pay for it. Pay for it? Mr. Sitwell sighed. Mamie, I think you have misunderstood the man's intention. He doesn't actually mean to manufacture the sauce. This is about a wager. I'm sorry if the man insulted you, but none of this actually concerns us. He's upset with Barclay and wants to rub his nose in it. It's something between the two of them. Then let it stay between the two of them and keep the sauces out of it. I have made more than enough sacrifices for this house. I'm not going to allow these people to start stealing recipes from me as well. Why must you think of it as stealing? All he is asking is that you prepare the sauce once more, same as yesterday. What harm is in it? I am not going to give them the recipe for free, and neither shall you. Do you hear me? I forbid it. Mr. Sitwell frowned. Must you speak to me like a child? Must you behave like one? Mamie glared at him. All I'm really asking is that you act like you've got the sense we both know your mother gave you, and say nothing. The door swung open and Ginny rushed in. Mr. Barclay would like to speak to you, Sitwell. Wants you to come to the study. He passed through the swinging door. At last, he arrives, Mr. Pound said. Do you want me to keep reading? Okay. Mr. Pound said as Mr. Sitwell entered the study. He was standing behind Mr. Barclay's desk while Mr. Barclay sat in a chair that had been pushed to the side of the room and was angled to face the window. On top of the desk was a bowl in which a small portion of the previous day's sauce had been placed. Now, finally, let us take care of this matter for once and for all. Sir? Mr. Sitwell looked at his employer. I don't understand. Mr. Barclay sighed. Mr. Pound seems quite intent in involving you in our negotiations. I want that recipe from yesterday, the one for the sauce, Mr. Pound said. If you want me to take this plant off your hands, Barclay, then you will give it to me. It is as simple as that. Yet somehow, so far, I can't get a straight answer as to who prepared it. For all I know, none of you did. Perhaps it was purchased from a can. No, it was not purchased from a can, Mr. Sitwell said. The truth is, and I apologize for any confusion about this yesterday, Mamie and I prepared it together. And unfortunately, she is not amenable to sharing the recipe at this moment. Is that right? Mr. Pound said. Well, we don't need her to be amenable, do we? He held out the bowl of sauce. Smell it. Sir, your parlor trick, as you did with the wafers and the wine. Perhaps she can't tell me what you put in it, but you certainly can tell me what she did. Mr. Sitwell looked at Mr. Barclay, who said nothing. The man looked hideously rattled, as if his interactions with this man over the past few days had aged him several decades. Well, what are you waiting for? Mr. Sitwell looked down at the bowl. I need a minute. The sauce is a bit more complicated than wafers, you understand. Mamie is quite the artist in the kitchen, as surely you're aware, having tasted her cooking. Her contribution to the sauce, the special seasoning she created to accommodate your dietary restrictions, was far more elaborate than mine, if less substantial in terms of actual volume. Mr. Pound nodded. Do you understand that I intend to compensate you, separate from my negotiations with Barclay? Mr. Pound began rummaging through Mr. Barclay's desk. He pulled out a piece of paper from the side drawer and wrote a number on it. He handed it to Mr. Sitwell, who stared down at it, noting the 3 zeros. This is what I'm prepared to pay you. Again, that is entirely separate from my negotiations with Mr. Barclay. You see, I do mean to manufacture your sauce. Furthermore, once you sign proprietary ownership to me, I would like to put your image on the label of the can. It was always my intention to put someone on the label. Why not you? That way, everyone will know to associate the product with you. It will mean that your role as the creator of the sauce will be recognizable even by those colored citizens who, like yourself, cannot actually read the copy. For everyone else, you will be identified as what you even now seem determined to prove yourself to be, the epitome of the loyal servant. Is that okay?
Yeah,
All
that's
right.
perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So I don't know if that Mr. Sitwell's trick of smelling things, being able to, he has this trick he does to entertain guests, which is that he'll smell something and can tell you what the ingredients are. So that's what that was all referring to. Okay.
I mean, unless you want to keep reading.
No, that's
Okay,
fine.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, thank you. I could listen to you.
Oh, that's nice.
All right.
That's nice.
I was wondering. I mean, I also find this really like telling, this moment when he tells him, there has to, your face has to be on there, and that means something. I mean, obviously it means something beyond the fact that it's easier for people to recognize the product.
Yes.
It means something more than that.
Yes. I was, you sent me something, we were talking about High on the Hog.
Yeah.
With Jessica, and I had, when the book came out, I did a dialogue with her work, her research on African, sort of the influence of African-American chefs on cuisine in the United States. It's often unrecognized in the artistry of that. So because I was talking about the use of, when the book came out, there were the Black Lives Matter protests, and as a result, finally, right, you still had Aunt Jemima pancakes being sold in the United States, right, which actually also, that is a product that premiered at the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, which is talked about, that a lot of stuff was. And they removed Uncle Ben and the Cream of Wheat Man, whose name is Rastus. Most people don't know his name is Rastus. But it's shocking that these things have been appearing on these labels. So I was saying, and I was associating it with, again, the commodities thing. Like, there's a book called Slave in a Box. Why did they use these pictures of black? Because it's like these modern products, it's like having your own slave. They will do the work for you. So it's a way of sort of like symbolizing like the luxury of pre-prepared foods and things like that, because you don't have to do work in the kitchen and stuff like that. So, and she was saying though, isn't it interesting, because they also seem to convey, despite all of that, quality at the same time. So all these like caricatures that are so endearing, also conveying quality at the same time. But that's very interesting to me. Yeah. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, totally. And I'm not even sure. That was
very fascinating. That happened. Like they made these announcements, like maybe 3 months before this book came out. Like, we're going to finally. Why did these things endure for so long? What were they still? I mean, because it's the kind of thing that people are like, well, is it really that important? I don't know. Why is it still there? It's like on one hand, it's like, if it's not that important, just leave it. But then on the other hand, if it's not that important, why not just change it? Like, why does it take so much effort to get rid of these? And what are they conveying to people today?
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there are like all of these like cultural ambiguities around that.
Yeah. So that was part of that too.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So another question, and that goes a bit away from the book actually, although we could also still talk a little bit about the second part of the question that I had, also regarding High on the Hog, which is this, I don't know if you're familiar with it, are you? It's a documentary, you can watch it on Netflix. It's really great. It centers the history of African American food traditions in American cuisine, actually. And yeah, I was wondering, because you're also talking about that, the relationship of African Americans and American food culture, and the way in which those, yeah, well, actually only one thing influenced the other, I'm thinking. But yeah, maybe you could say a little bit about sort of the cultural significance of this relationship between African American food traditions, American culture, and the way that, you know, African Americans influence that culture.
I really was, you know, it's funny because I tell people should watch. That's a very good documentary, and so to the extent that I know about that, really it was in particular Jessica Harris's work, which I guess inspired the documentary. It's named, that's the name of her book, High on the Hog, to just really appreciate, because people usually think of just soul food, or like they have very specific ideas about African American cuisine, and then there's this contradiction, because there's black chefs were everywhere. They were cooking for Thomas Jefferson and all this stuff, and so they actually, there's a lot of artistry that's sort of not acknowledged, and some of them had an enormous influence on the cuisine, what we consider like, there's a part, I don't know, it's a kind of minor, but that, what's his name? Hemmings, who cooked for Thomas Jefferson, and they were saying like he brought the recipe for macaroni
For mac and cheese, yeah, absolutely.
That's like just a minor thing, but it's like, so they've had all kinds of influences on cuisine there.
And I also found that fascinating, because I think, having grown up in Germany, mac and cheese is sort of this
so
you
funny.
have this idea that this is like this, essentially American
It is so
dish. And then, you come across this documentary, and then suddenly you're basically being told that it's actually French.
Right. So there's all kinds of, but I was really more interested in them as commodities, So food as products. But that's it does all tie into that.
Are there any questions in the audience at this point? Maybe you want to join in on the conversation. I mean, if not, it's also okay. I have more questions, but I wanted to also give you a chance to join us. Can also ask something. Yes. Yeah.
I haven't read the book, so this is just based on what I read. What inspired the character?
You know what's another thing? Well, Sitwell, again, I was really thinking of, in part, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that book, and Tom shows. But I will say that the Rib King, this book is technically a prequel to my first novel. So the Rib King is actually mentioned in the very first, before I even had thought of this story. The Rib King appears as he's the ancestor of all the characters in my first novel. So he's always been there, but his story didn't occur to me until I was almost finished with the first book. So, yeah. But I really did want to write about the epitome of a loyal servant, and sort of think about what was actually going on with him as he's performing this role. Yeah. That was a lot. I talked about a lot of stuff. So
Oh yeah.
you mean of gender, just in terms of, or what?
The social hierarchy
Yeah. That's really complicated.
I'm sorry. I'm
yeah.
just gonna quickly repeat the question because
Okay.
I just got a text that the people who are watching can't really hear the audience questions.
Okay.
Sorry. So I think if I understood correctly, the question was about sort of intersectional relations in the book, right? So how, and I guess how those categories sort of play or relate to each other. Yeah, was that correct? And the first question was actually about Mr. Sidwell and what inspired Ladee to write that character.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I would really, in terms of Mamie, well, she's very disrespected by Mr. Whitmore, who works in the kitchen, and Mr. Sitwell actually adores Mamie. And so I think I was trying to, more interested in the complicated dynamics between, I guess, black men and black women in the kitchen. The symbolic kitchen, the real and symbolic kitchen. So because it is complicated, and more than I was thinking about intersectionality and power relations, I'm aware that it's really about the kitchen. If it's like someone said upstairs, downstairs, it's really about downstairs. It's about downstairs, and that is an issue. It was an issue in Mamie's past. Again, sort of part of the tension in the house was she didn't want to be a maid because it meant that she had to interact sometimes with the Barclays party guests, and that's part of why she wanted to go in the kitchen, because she felt she would be less vulnerable to assault. So there's certainly a lot of stuff about her specific situation as a woman, but I do think it's a little bit more dynamic. Like, I didn't want to just, because that's how I saw the characters and the people in it, that it's like it's more of a dynamic world. Not everybody's like that. Mr. Sitwell's actually a very good man. He's a very good man. He just, had a little breakdown. A little crisis. But he's a good man, and he loves Mamie. He adores Mamie. And he thinks she's a better cook than Mr. Boudreaux was. That she more than deserved his job because she was the better cook. Yeah, he has no problem saying that.
Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, he has her back kind of throughout, and he's very conscious sort of the hierarchy in the kitchen also.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that also, can I just say, because I was talking about Mamie, that was important to me in terms, again, when I was saying the construction of how the Mammy stereotypes, how she supposedly behaves in the front of the house, and then in the back of the house she's like this very domineering, emasculating person. She's a strong woman because her job is very hard, and she has a lot of responsibilities.
Yes.
And he sees that and he respects it. He does not feel emasculated by being in the company of a strong woman. And what she was actually doing, and what often was required of mammies, required a lot of strength. So that was part of what was going on in the kitchen with them as well. Yeah. So I'm sorry.
No, absolutely. No, please don't be. I was also. Now I also think about Mammy and also the Mammy stereotype actually, and I was reminded of Uncle Tom's Cabin and the way in which sort of, now I forget her name. Is she also called Mammy? I'm not sure.
No, I don't.
But it's Uncle Tom's
I have not read that book in a very long time.
Yeah, I don't really remember. But what I do remember from the book is that. She has to sort of, she kind of rules sort of the family. She rules the kitchen.
Yes.
She actually has a lot of sort of territory that she has to look over.
Yes. Yeah. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work.
Absolutely. The next question, if there are no questions in the audience at this point, yes. Hi.
Oh.
The question was how Ladee came up with the storyline of the book, and envisioning the characters.
Oh, that's so interesting. I don't know. I actually don't know how to articulate that. I think of the characters first. I think of the characters first, and then the situation, and then it just, in terms of this, it was, again, I really wanted to write about a man that was trying really hard to be a caregiver, and it sort of intersected the idea of the Rib King, and I don't know, this was the story of him that came out of me. Do you know? It's hard to, that's where I start, so I don't really know. I can tell you some of the thing about Cherokee Red is a bit personal. So I did, you notice that I write about history because very bizarrely, someone wrote a book in the 1830s about, that had slave characters in it that were my ancestors. And I guess they were comic relief in this book. So I know I've heard family stories about these people that greatly contradict the way they're portrayed in this book. But it's inscribed, it's a document from a period of time where in North Carolina, which is where they live, it was actually illegal for black people to read and write, and you would be punished. I believe in 1833, the punishment or penalty was like 30 lashes or something if you were caught reading or writing, which meant people couldn't write their own stories, right? So it's probably a little bit of a personal issue for me because I'm very conscious of that. It's not that personal, but I'm conscious of that. I know that this book exists and it means something. And it's sort of weird because it is a rare sort of representation of my ancestors. And there's not a lot of documentation of my slave ancestors. But it's very insulting and full of lies. So it's like an irony. It's a monument to erasure. That's how I always think of it. So I think that the combination of sort of what is going on inside of me personally and the characters, this is the story that came out of it. Yeah.
Okay. Any further questions from the audience? Otherwise, I have them. Yeah. Okay.
Personally, not having read the book yet, I was wondering when you were reading chapter 6 and the dialogue between Manny and Sibyl, if there's a conflict growing between the two of them, because eventually Sibyl sells the rest
Yes.
and gives up the rest. And I was wondering if you, in the story, also touch upon this conflict of African Americans being pitted against each other, so in a way like a divide and conquer idea by Mr. Barclay and Arthur, or
Yes.
so and of course you don't know the way it started.
No.
So but I was wondering how you deal with that in the book in your writing.
One of the things that comes up in Mr. Sitwell's section of the book is that there's a lot of violence against African Americans going on in the city that they're surrounded by, and it has to do with a labor strike. So if it's pitting people against each other, there's more explicit reference to pitting workers against each other in racial terms. So there was the butcher, actually, Mr. Whitmore, who is a chauffeur. He came up because he was told he's a butcher. I don't even remember what it's called in here. It's a skill though that he has, and he was recruited to come from Alabama. And he says he didn't realize till he got there that he was a scab. That they were bringing people up so that it would because all the people were on strike for better, and I think that there is a lot of, and I think about that a lot, is the ways in which sort of like workers are sort of pitted against each other, and then it's sort of disempowering to everybody because they're fighting amongst themselves. So yeah, and so he talks about trying to, we tried to talk to them because none of us wanted to be in that, and it just turned into this big very violent thing. And that's true, those types of encounters, especially because all the research for this book is based in Chicago. So I was thinking a lot about the meat packers unions and sort of turmoil with that. So that I was thinking of more, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. If there are no more questions, are there questions? Yeah, no? Okay, maybe then I think because we were, we have like about 10 minutes left. Yeah,
okay.
I think. And, but of course we can go a bit over time, depending on how everybody's feeling. But my last question is maybe more about like bringing sort of the context of the novel back into present times. And regarding your first novel, The Talented Ripkens, I have this quote here from an interview that you did with The Guardian, where you said that so much is left out of official narratives of history, and yet so much is retained through stories and oral histories.
Yeah.
And I know we've already sort of touched upon the topic a little bit, but when you had to formulate the way in which the story that you wrote, which is a historical novel, resonates in the present, what would you say? How does that work? How the narrative or the things that you touch upon in the book, how do they transport into the present? How do we?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Maybe also with regards to political movements at the moment and.
Well, I was the thing about minstrelsy and masking, and I said that I really started to write about it. It was very hard before it was finished. It was very, very hard to explain like why is this your reaction to all these things going to write a historical novel. But also, one thing is I thought a lot about in terms of the mass. And the Menstrual Mass, which is it's a metaphor that comes up a lot in terms of African American sort of being required to perform identities in public spaces. It's used a lot, and it originates really with minstrelsy. Again, there's like that Paul Laurence Dunbar poem from 1895, "We Wear the Mask," right? And then Du Bois talks about the veil and double consciousness. And so I was really struck by all the talk. Again, I don't know how familiar people are with Trayvon Martin, with the hoodie. And I was like, I think that was the connection for me in terms of that was the way they talked about it, because he's a teenager, right? And then and this is a grown man that's following him, and I don't know how you should appropriately respond to that, but the idea that because of the way he was dressed, and specifically that somehow he was suspicious, this made him suspicious, and also a lot of the reports were that he should have realized that they made him suspicious.
Yeah.
And I was like, that is so crazy and wild. That you're responsible for sort of stereotypes about you. You're going to be held accountable for not acting. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like this has nothing to do with reality, but you must always behave as if it is reality, and in this case, you could literally be killed. And that somehow, this kind of warped logic making sense to people, that's where I think I wanted to, the minstrelsy stuff came from, because it still resonates in such disturbing ways today.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Yeah. And then the rest, I talked about that book about my ancestors, like that when anybody I think that is talking about African American history, there's going to be huge gaps and huge erasures and things that are just not, they're not there. And part of the reason is because there was African American literacy was considered so threatening, right? So people there's not often an account, there's no stories, and so you have to fill in the blanks. or you have to listen to what your grandmother told you, and then what she's telling you what her grandma. So it's like you're getting the version that finally gets to you, and try to make sense of that, you know, which can be complicated as well. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Any more questions? I don't want to exclude you or not give you a chance to ask. No? Yeah.
Ladee, maybe talking about the present, can you talk about the Descendants, what you're working on here, and the inspiration you're finding here in Berlin and at the American Academy, and what that process is like?
That's harder for me to talk about because I'm still writing it. So, but yeah, no, and it's weird. It's funny because it is about. I've been writing it for a while, but it is harder for me to talk about things before they're finished. But it's about. It is about I was interested in the war on drugs and its relationship to sort of the history of using African Americans in medical testing. It was interesting because it already started in the aftermath of a pandemic, right? But it was set like 40 years after a pandemic. And I started writing it before before COVID. So that was very strange and interesting. So I don't know, I guess it's something people were talking about before, but it's been a very interesting process. There's a lot about marginalization, and there's also a lot about literal walls and things like that. And there were just a lot of reasons why I thought this would be a very interesting. Sometimes it's easy if you step out of where you are to see it differently. So that's part of why I wanted to work on it outside of the United States for a little bit. But yeah, no, it's been very generative for me to be here. So it's hard for me to talk about the specific plot of it because it's not done yet. So. But thanks for asking about it, though.
Okay. If we don't have any further questions, we are almost hitting our 90-minute mark. So yeah. Then I would also, these were very nice. Those were nice closing statements. Also about the idea of sort of looking at the U.S. from outside. And I mean, in the last conversation we had, we also talked a little bit about how things are here and what blackness in Germany means, and you know how things are different. And I'm very curious how that sort of will influence your process also.
I am curious as well. No, it's fascinating. Yeah. It's fascinating because you know that is the United States is a particular context, you know, and so it helps to see that. It's easier to see that, and it allows you to think about it in different ways, to sort of experience how dynamics are worked out differently in different places. So that's been very interesting as well for me while I've been here. So.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So thanks everybody for being here. Thank you for your questions and contributions. Thank you for listening. And again, thank you to everyone who has made this evening possible. And have a good Thursday, right? Yeah. Thursday. Have a good Thursday evening. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Yay.
Are you signing books? Yeah.